Now, I'd like to extend this morning a very warm welcome to John Walters to deliver his presentation, Wildlife of Devon from Shore to Moor. John is a wildlife artist, as you will see from the cards that he's got on the table at the back. They're absolutely delightful and they're on sale for £1.50 after his presentation. As you see, he's obviously an artist, he's a photographer and also an ecologist, a very talented gentleman. He's written and illustrated several publications. He's been involved in many interesting and varied projects. And he's undertaken an invertebrate survey of road verges for the Highways Agency, which I think would be most interesting actually. He's worked with the BBC Natural History Unit on many TV programmes and the award-winning Small Talk Diaries, The Natural World and the David Attenborough series, Life in the Undergrowth. So we welcome this morning a man of many various talents who's also thought ahead and brought his own projector, which has helped us out enormously. So thank you very much, John. So a warm welcome to John.
So this morning, thanks for coming out on this rather damp morning to listen to this talk. I'll be talking to you about the wildlife in Devon, from starting off down the shore and then working way up onto the moors. First of all, I'll give you a little brief intro to myself. Some of that's been just covered just now by Christine. And then I'll tell you some wildlife stories from around the county and some quite local to here as well. So I grew up on Hayling Island in Hampshire, and then I came down to work for, I came down to college, to Art College at Falmouth in the late 1980s, where I studied graphic design. And then I was lucky enough to get a job working for the Dartmoor National Park Authority as graphic designer. I worked there for several years. And then since 1999, I've become a freelance ecologist. So I do all sorts of things, which I'll talk about in a minute. I live with my wife Joyce and our youngest, well, we have two sons, they're both pretty well left home now. Barnaby, our eldest son, lives in Vienna, and he's a hurdy-gurdy maker and computer programmer. And our youngest son, Oscar, on the right there, he's an outdoor guy. He works at Skern Lodge up in North Devon at Appledore. So he's just on break at the moment, but he's back there in a few weeks' time. And my wife is a teacher. She teaches A-level psychology and criminology at Coombs Head College in Newton Abbot. I've been interested in wildlife ever since I was tiny, ever since I can remember really. And so I've always been passionate about wildlife, and I've been lucky enough to make it my work. And I like to explore the natural world through observations, through drawing and painting, which I do always in the field. So I do take a lot of photographs and videos now, which I'll be showing you today, but I always draw from life in the field. So I can't actually draw indoors, I just can't do it. So I have to get out there, even if it's wild and windy or whatever, I get out and draw things on the spot. This is me drawing. This is actually in Sweden, just before the first lockdown. I went out there to see some special long-tailed tits, which have white heads. I'll be showing you some long-tailed tits later on. And when I paint in the field, I just use the basic watercolours, just a few tubes of watercolour, some pencils, and it just goes in my bag, and I can get out. It's really about getting out there and looking at things. It took about an hour or so to paint, which shows you quick time. So I used to work with a few tubes of watercolour and mix all the colours from just 4 or 5 tubes. Just enables me to work quickly. I've just seen these birds come out of their roost, and they're sat in this little willow tree. So it's all done and dusted in the field. And I've used these cards, which if you'd like to have a look at those after the talk. Produced a number of publications over the years. This books on wildlife of Dartmoor, mini beasts and rock pool life. And I do a little section in the Dartmoor magazine in each issue. I used to do a little sketchbook page, part of the page with Nick Baker, but now I do the whole thing. There's a few selection of cards. These are all from field paintings. Most of them are done around Devon. So when I'm taking photographs, I use a few different cameras. I use 2 different bridge cameras, a Sony RX10 camera, a Canon SX70, and a little Olympus TG Tough camera. The TG Tough camera is very handy. It's just pops in a pocket. It's you can even put it underwater. So it's taking some pictures of toads and then spawning toads. And it's also got a super microscope mode, so I can take pictures of tiny little creatures. This is one of the rarest spiders in the world. It's called the horrid ground weaver. It's only ever been found in Plymouth, and only about 153, I think. And I've seen most of them myself, actually. I didn't discover it, but I've done a lot of work on it. And they're found in just 2 or 3 sites in Plymouth in old quarries. It's a tiny little money spider. You can see one there on the stone there. And it only seems to come out during the winter. As well as that, I've done a lot of work on TV programs. Sometimes you may have seen me on television occasionally on the One Show or Spring Watch, but I'm usually in the background finding things for them to film or helping them film various bugs, including this film which I helped Martin Dawn make last year now, My Garden of 1,000 Bees. There are some clips of that online if you'd like to have a look at those. It's a fabulous film, and it did win some top awards. You know, it was up against things like the Green Planet and things like that, but it still won. And it won several awards as well. It's really quite a stunning film. So we're starting down on the coast now. This is flying over Hope Cove, just a Pole Tail. And a few years ago, down on the coast, just a little bit further along from there, this creature appeared, a humpback whale, and it hung around for a little while just off Slapton Beach and did a little tour around the southwest. Quite amazing to see it. At times just about 20 or 30 metres off the beach, just cruising up and down, catching fish. So amazing thing to see. A little bit further along the coast, this is at Start Point, and I'd like to go down there, especially in the last few years, to see another mega fish, really, which turns up in, sort of started to turn up in larger numbers in recent years. So I go down there, usually about November is a good time to see them at Start Point. And walking across down to the lighthouse area, there's an enormous splash, which is gigantic. And you see just to catch a glimpse of a fin. And then when you're lucky, you can see the whole fish come out. This is an Atlantic bluefin tuna. Now, these fish used to occur around the British coast many years ago. Then they thought they may have been hunted to extinction. They certainly were overfished. But in recent years, they've started to make a comeback, and now there are actually thousands of them in sort of southwest approaches, really, in late summer and autumn, and they can turn up along the south coast. You may even see them off Exmouth. They're absolutely enormous. It's hard really to judge the scale, but if you can see that bird there is a gannet, which has a 6-foot wingspan. These are truly enormous fish. They grow up to 2 or 3 meters long, and they have they're supercharged as well. They're able to raise their body temperature, so almost hot-blooded certainly compared to most other fish, and they can outrace the smaller fish which they feed on. So, and you can often see them race. They hunt in packs, and they race through shoals of smaller fish, and sometimes jump out of the water. So really spectacular. Quite difficult to work out where they're going to jump. So trying to get a bit of video there was tricky, but I did. This was last year at Start Point, and there was a bait ball with the gannets diving into the bait ball, and occasionally the tuna would jump. And you know those fish, so I left the camera running and got a few tuna jumping out as well. Although similar things will obviously occur on the coast here anyway. You get some nice rocky shore. And I like to get down, particularly on low spring tides, and get right out onto the furthest point at the lowest point of the tide, because that's the bit of the beach which doesn't usually get uncovered, so you find unusual things there. Like this is a spiny starfish. This starfish is about 1 foot or so across, but a big starfish, and it eats other starfish, so it eats the sort of common red starfish. And when I'm looking here, I'm not necessarily looking at rock pools, it's under weed and rocks, so searching under stones and seaweed. And you find all sorts of strange things. This is a furrow crab, a little hermit crab, and this one's a squat lobster, like a miniature lobster, that 5 or 6 centimeters long. But it's very similar. It flicks its tail and can swim backwards. Lots of crabs there as well. This is a big edible crab. And now edible crabs are quite docile. They lock themselves. They use their legs to lock themselves in crevices if they're disturbed or feel threatened. Whereas this one, the velvet swimming crab, is quite aggressive. It's a swimming crab. It has fins on its legs, so it can swim through the water. Its other name is the devil crab. It has these red eyes, and it is quite a ferocious thing. If you go near it, it can draw blood. So you can sort of handle it with care in this thing. It's got these beautiful blue pincers, but it's quite aggressive if you go near it. Other fish you can find, this is a tom-pot blenny, which I know occurs down off the beach here. And these fish are like chameleons, they can change colour. So what we did is took a tank down with us and put some colourful rocks and things in this tank. But when we found this fish, it was just a dull brown colour in amongst the seaweed. Put it in the tank, within 5 minutes it changed its colour, so it can see its background and then change its colour to match. So it produces these beautiful stripes and really blended into the background. Stunning thing. So that's the tom-pot blenny. It has these weird tentacles above its eyes. I'm not sure what they're for, but it's certainly quite a comical looking fish. And quite big as well, so the size of my iPad. This is a worm pipefish, relative of the seahorses. And like the seahorses, it's the male who looks after the young. So the male has a pouch on his front, and the female will lay her eggs into the pouch, and then the male will look after the eggs and the young pipefish when they've just emerged. And another strange looking fish, this is a Cornish clingfish or Cornish sucker. And this one, put it in the tank, you can see it has a suction pad on the side of it. It can stick to rocks. So it likes to live on really sort of rough, wave-swept sort of rocky coasts where it's very rough and windy often, often the seas churn up. So it needs to be able to stick itself tight to the rock so it doesn't get washed away. That's the Cornish kingfish. Another fish now, this fish lives in the sea, but breeds in the rivers, so it's the Atlantic salmon. And during the autumn, I watch them on the River Team, and what the fish do is they go into the estuary, usually in late summer or early autumn, and they wait there because they need to get upstream, up towards Chagford and Kidley, that sort of area near Kidley Hotel, up on the upper reaches of the Tee to breed. But to get there, the river needs to be reasonably high. So what they do is wait for a day like today, actually, when it absolutely pours of rain, a huge surge of water down the river, and that gives them the opportunity to get up the river very quickly. So what I do is in October, I keep an eye on the weather forecast, and particularly if it's been dry, and then you get a sudden deluge of rain, usually wait a day or so, because the fish take a little while to get up. But I go up to a weir just near Castle Drogo on the Team there, and you can see the fish jump. And if you hit it right, you can see dozens of these fish jumping at very close range. And you can get photographs of them. They're quite tricky. You get like the tuna. It's hard to know when they're going to jump, but there are so many at this site that you can do it. And these are big salmon, big adult salmon coming up the river, and they breed in gravelly beds in the upper reaches of the river. So that's why they're heading up into the upper sort of slower moving stretches of the river. A little bit of video of this. My Sony camera, which has a thing called an end trigger. So it's constantly running at high speed, but if the salmon jumps, and I've got 4 seconds to press the button, I'll get the fish jumping. So you can't really fail it. And you can get quite close to the weir too, so you're pretty close, and the fish are jumping out. I've had one almost hit me once. It was a huge grey salmon. It was a bit shocked, but he was a bit more shocked than me. So this usually occurs sometime in October, occasionally in November, depending on the season and how much rain there's been. But certainly one of the spectacles to see in Devon. One more big one jumping across the screen. Amazing power of fish. On this day, the water was actually too high for them to get over. But as the water level lowers a little bit the next day, then they're able to jump. And if it lowers a little bit more, they can just swim right through the weir. A bit closer to home now. I recognise this place, I'm sure. And I often come to Exmouth, particularly in the summer, to look for bees. It's a superb place for bees on the sand dunes here. And all sorts of different bees. They're quite unobtrusive, some of these things. They're quite small insects, but it's really fascinating. Little leafcutter bees, these are silvery leafcutter bees, which nest in abundance on them there. Very common. Another one is actually a wasp, the bee wolf. And this is one that hunts for honeybees. That's a mating pair. You see the male is much, much smaller than the female. And it's the female who does all the work, digs the burrow and catches the honeybees to feed the young. And here's one bringing in a honeybee into their lair. So they dig burrows, sometimes up to 1 metre deep into the sand, and then they provision their young with cells filled with, well, they're not dead, they're actually paralysed honeybees. As well as these bigger ones, there's little tiny wasps and bees as well. This is a very, very small wasp called Oxybelis. It hasn't got an English name, and it catches flies. So it's often around where the dog bins are, because there's lots of flies attracted to those areas. And you see this tiny, tiny little wasp, but you don't tend to notice it until it's caught a fly. When it catches the fly, it carries it back to its nest it has a barbed sting, and it just attaches the fly to its back end, and then flies with it, so it doesn't have to carry it, it just fly with this little fly stuck to the back of it. Lots of other bees there. There's these various ones here. These are male pantaloon bees, and there's a little furrow bee at the bottom of the allium head there. And other things which are bees but don't necessarily look like bees. This is a cuckoo bee. It's a cuckoo bee of leafcutter bees. And it's a thing called a Coleopsis, a sharp-tailed bee. And it has a sharp tail because the leafcutter bees, you probably know, make little nests out of sections of leaf in a hole in a wall, usually, or sometimes in the sand dunes. And so the females made these little nests, fill them with pollen, laid her egg inside them. Along comes this sharp-tailed bee. The female of this has got a sharp tail, and she cuts a hole into the leafcutter bee's nest, and then lays her egg in it, and the larva of the sharp-tailed bee will eat all the food and the larva of the leafcutter bee. So we've got about 280 bees in the UK, and about a quarter of them actually never collect pollen, or they do feed on nectar, but they don't collect pollen or make nests themselves. They're cuckoos in nests of other bees. So this is the bee that one goes for. It's called the coast leafcutter bee, and this one nests in little holes in the paths, on the edges of the paths on the net. Quite a common one. Now, male bees are generally smaller, like the bee wolf, which I showed you, the wasp. The same with bees. The males are usually smaller, they don't live very long, and they have one purpose in life, which is to mate with the females. There's not a great deal of courtship goes on in the bee and wasp world. Basically, the males fly around rapidly, and the first one to spot a newly emerged female jumps on her and mates with her. So it's a huge amount of competition between the males. And it's it's been a tough life for a male bee or wasp, because they don't live very long and they completely exhaust themselves. So they've got to take any opportunities they can get. The females get a bit fed up with them after a while. This is a female pantaloon bee, and she's already mated, and so she will have a burrow in the ground. But when she comes back to her burrow, she often gets jumped on by males, so she has to boot them off with her big furry back legs. You can see that. So she's ejecting that male. When she first emerges, she only mates once. So once she first comes out of the ground, usually about end of June, she'll mate, and then after that, she'll just kick the males off. Now, the males are so frantic to mate with things, they don't always get it right. And I was sitting there one day, so it's on the very eastern end of the net, just by the roundabout, there's a little corner there. And I was sat there, and there was some ragwort with some cinnabar moth caterpillars, and they'd eaten all the ragwort, and they started to walk off to look for new bits. And of course, they walk across the path, and these male bees, they see something striking, and they jump on it. Realise at the last second, of course, that it's not a bee, but it's actually a caterpillar, so it's not much use. A little bit of video of them actually doing this. You see they're flying around, spot it, jump on it, and then think, oh no, it's not a bee, it's not a female, it's some other creature. Now, Exmouth is the top spot in Devon to see this bee. It's about the size of a honeybee. It has enormous, great furry back legs, which is why it gives it the name of the pantaloon bee. It's a little bit like a sort of glam rock bee, I think, with these big glam rock trousers on. And it nests in the sand, and it uses these big back legs to clear out its burrow. And it feeds on things like hawkweed flowers, as yellow sort of dandelion type flowers, which only open in the mornings. So it tends to collect the pollen in the morning, and then in the afternoon it spends all their time cleaning out the burrow, which gets filled with sand. So if you're out in sort of early July, sometime in July, you often see this, particularly in the afternoon, these bees digging out their burrows. Starlings. Now, starlings have decreased enormously in this country as a breeding bird, but we still get large numbers which come over from Eastern Europe mainly to spend the winter here. So when we get these really big flocks in the winter, they're mainly birds from there. They arrive in October and go back in March. Now the various roosts you can go and see, some of you may have seen the roosts up at Moor on Sunset Levels, which is really quite a spectacle to see. I spend a lot of time going out looking at the various roosts, but over the last couple of winters, we've been lucky enough to have a small roost of about 2,000 birds in our road. It's literally only about 100 yards from my house. And they roost in a little tree in someone's garden. And usually there's so many birds that you can't actually count them. There's, I've seen sometimes maybe 1 million, maybe 2 million that we can actually count on Dartmoor. But with this flock, you can actually count them. I can get a photograph of the whole flock and then go through a Photoshop and put little dots on them. So I knew there were just over 2,000 birds in that flock. Or -1 actually, because the sparrowhawk caught one, just they went to the roost. So the roost attracts sparrowhawks and local peregrines as well, come in and take them once they know the birds are roosting there. And that was the tree just in someone's garden. They'll pile into this tree. But sometimes they are, sometimes not. They did turn up this autumn again for a little while, and then they moved on. So now just the resident starlings, so there's about 30 odd that roost there every night. So this is just up the road from our garden. We live in a 1970s housing estate. It's in the middle of Buckfordsley. So we haven't got an enormous garden, but it is a wildlife haven. I've got this Cotoneaster, which flowers in the summer and then produces lots of berries in the winter, which are a magnet for these birds, which is another migrant from Northern Europe, from Scandinavia, and also from Iceland, the redwing. It's a smaller version of our song thrush, but with nice red patches on the side. This is a little bit of video from just before Christmas, when we had that snow, and they were coming in. This was literally just outside my office window, so I was able, it's a bit of a distraction, but they were trying to do some work, but they were coming in and feeding on the berries. This is, and they have to have, they're quite small birds, so if the berry's too big, they reject it. So they have to have just the right size, and they're quite acrobatic as well, just trying to pick the berries out. If it's the right size, they'll swallow it. And this is using my Sony camera as well to capture the movement in slow motion. But lots of frogs in the garden, and they've started to appear now, so the frog mating season, obviously, fairly early in the year, usually in February. So this is, they are active at night, and also in the daytime sometimes in our ponds. We can have up to 70 frogs. Breaking them up, cutting off and trying. But what happens is the male frogs appear. We've also already had one. They hang around in the pond and then they wait for the females to come in. And by each female comes in, the male will grab her, and then the males keep hold of her. They've got competitions between who can keep hold of the female before she lays her eggs. This is on the heathlands. I spent a lot of time. We're lucky enough to have a real wide variety of habitats in Devon. So this is on the East Devon Pebblebed Heath, just up the road at Picton Common, and lots of interesting wildlife there. Sundews, these strange plants with sticky blobs on their leaves, and they live in a nutrient-poor habitat, so they need to get extra nutrients, and they do this by attracting insects somehow, which are how they're attracted. Like these damselflies, they get stuck on it, and then they die, and then the plant will ingest the minerals from the insect's body. And one of my favourite insects lives there, and it's the heath potter wasp. Now this is a fabulous little creature. It's related to the sort of wasps that you might get coming in your house. It's a solitary species, harmless to us, and it builds these beautiful clay pots, about the size of a large pea, I suppose. They're quite small, but they're beautiful little creatures. So they take about 2 or 3 hours to build the pot, and then they provision them like the bee wolf does, but instead of bees, these ones use tiny caterpillars. This one flying in, and they just stuff the caterpillar in the pot. Another insect, which is quite common, and it's about sort of 5 or 6 centimetres long, and it does resemble a hornet. It even makes a loud buzz. And this is an ambush predator, so it sits around on bits of dung and whatever, and it flies up and catches creatures like grasshoppers and dung beetles and all sorts of things, anything it can catch really. And you can see this is a mating pair, and you see the male there on the top. He has very spiky legs, which he's able to catch his prey and fly. Also on the heaths, one of the mysterious birds, which no doubt many of you here will have seen or at least heard, and that's the nightjar. These are about the size of a collared duck, but they're really, really hard to see. I mean, they're nocturnal, as the name suggests, so they feed mainly on moths. but they nest on the ground, and they don't actually make a nest even, they literally nest on the ground. The female, so the female on the nest, she'll lay a couple of eggs, and then she'll incubate those, and then the male and the female will feed the young. So that's with one of those youngsters, quite well grown. These birds appear usually in early May, and they disappear in September. And this time of year, they're way down in Africa. They put some satellite tags on them now, so they can work out where they go. So at the moment, they're way south of the Sahara, right to Central Africa, where they spend the winter. Another bird which is very camouflaged, which does the opposite thing. So it comes here for the winter, and this one comes from places like Finland and Russia. And it breeds way up on the sort of bogs, and the northern bogs of those places. And it likes the sort of muddy ditches. This is on Bubby Heath. And you can see it's been around. It has these, it's a wading bird, and you can see it's been probing in the mud. And there's one in there. Right there. It's very, very hard to see. Now this is, I think, called a jack snipe. A jack means small, so like jackdaw is a small daw or crow. So this is jack snipe, it's a small snipe. But whereas a common snipe, you may well have seen, that as soon as you go anywhere near them, they fly off. So you might be 20, 30 meters away and they fly off. The jack snipe doesn't do that. It relies completely on its camouflage. So you've got to literally almost tread on it before it flies. And it's so camouflaged that you do think, well, why didn't I see that? It was flown up right on my boot. So I spend a lot of time looking for them, and you can see it in there. And if you go, it's just sitting around, bobbing about. They have this weird bobbing walk they do, and they usually just doing that. But if you go near them and it spots you, it goes into this camouflage pose and sort of sneaks down like this, puts its tail up, and sits really still until, well, if you can try and spot them, then you can see it and just avoid it. If you almost tread on it, it will just fly away. But if you spot it in advance, I just look ahead of myself and just think, oh, there's one. I don't even look for a bird because they're so camouflaged. I just look for two stripes which are totally parallel. And then you think, well, that's got to be something. And then you realize the bird is there right in front of you. What a stunning creature. And it even has little bits of blue which reflect in the sunlight. So it looks a bit like water because it likes to sort of damp watery places on the heath. And these birds also occur around the coast and salt marshes. About a week ago, and a lot of people do this now, and you may have seen this it was on Winter Watch, I think last year. People are using thermal cameras and thermal scopes. So this is a heat. It tells the difference between the heat of objects. So in the winter, it works really well because birds have a warmer body temperature than us. But obviously, all the ground is really cold at this time of year. So I walk around the places where I know the jack snipe live, and just look through this little thing, and you can see them just glowing. So I don't need to tread on them. I need to go near them. I can spot them from several feet away, sometimes about 20, 30 meters away, and they're just this glowing. And in fact, I spotted this one, and I didn't realize that there was actually another one, because you could see it glowing, but you couldn't see it in the field. I could just about see maybe part of its head, but only because I knew there was another bird there. Quite amazing camouflage. This is a meadow picket. It's one of the commonest breeding birds on Dartmoor. I can tell you a story about another picket now. And this starts very locally here. Someone contacted me on Twitter towards the end of November about this funny-looking aphids that they found at Deer Park. And so they didn't know what it was, and I didn't know myself, actually. So I found out and identified it as a thing called a variegated oak aphid, which overwinters as eggs on the oak twigs. So I thought, well, I'll go and have a look at that at some point. So I asked the person, and they sent me a picture of the tree that it was on. And I thought, I'll go and pop in when I'm next in Exmouth. Then just before Christmas, a couple of weeks before Christmas, I actually went to the bank to pay some cash in Exeter, and they closed the TSB. I know they closed a lot of branches, but I thought, no, they closed the one right in the middle of Exeter, but they did. So anyway, I thought, well, where's the nearest one? Well, that's in Exmouth. I thought, well, I could go and look for that aphid thing while I'm at it. So I went down to the bank, paid the money, had a walk around the park. I had trouble finding it because I just had a photograph of the tree. So I was like looking around thinking, well, which tree is this? So I spent about an hour doing this and couldn't find it, couldn't find the tree. And it was getting a bit gloomy. It's one of those really dark, sort of gloomy afternoons about 2 o'clock. So I thought, well, I can't really go anywhere else now. I'll just look at every oak tree in the park and I'll find it. I walked up to the first oak tree and this bird popped up in front of me. It just hopped up on a twig and landed. I didn't even have my binoculars out because I usually do, but I wasn't really looking for birds. And I thought I was only going to just pop in there for 5 minutes. And I could see it silhouette and it was a skinny looking thing. I thought it might be just a robin to start with, but it obviously wasn't. And it was a little bird, and it was wagging its tail, and it flew away. Now, I'm a bit mad on pipits, so I knew immediately it wasn't a common pipit. It was, I think, an olive-backed pipit. And this is a bird which should really be in India or Nepal at this time of year. It actually breeds in Siberia, and they do turn up in Britain, maybe 20 or 30 each year, get blown over and to the East Coast, usually, a place like Fair Isle. Piles of silly. It's very unusual to see them in Devon. But I followed it, and sure enough, it was an olive-backed pipit. It was a very tame olive-backed pipit as well. And lots of people came to see it over the next few days, and we were delighted to see it, because it's usually a very difficult bird to see. It skulks around and is very hard. But this one was a very obliging bird. I did get to see the aphids as well the next day. So that's the eggs of this aphid. And then I came back again to do some drawings of the pipit. It's a lovely little bird. And it was cloudy most of the day, but the Thursday, the sun came out, so I went back especially to see it. Got a little bit of video of it, just by the drive. It was just creeping around. It was only because I almost trod on it, because I wouldn't have seen it otherwise. And it creeps around in the leaf litter, looking for all sorts of earwigs and things like that it was finding to eat. That kind of green shield bug. Now you may have found these in your garden and they really stink, and they didn't like that. Chuck that away. So the green shield bug's defence does work. I've never seen that before, but it's nice with a slow motion camera. You can actually record these things, and something which happens in the blink of an eye, you don't really see it happen. You can actually see exactly what it did. So it's really interesting. But back onto Dartmoor, these are the nether pickets, and they nest on the ground, usually tussocks in the grass. But this one hasn't just got its own eggs, it's been visited by the cuckoo. The cuckoos on Dartmoor are meadow pipit specialists, so the females will seek out meadow pipit nests and lay their eggs in those. The cuckoo has a number of strategies to trick the pipit. So you can see its egg there on the top left, but it's much smaller in proportion. The cuckoo's a much bigger bird than the pipit, but it lays an egg which is much smaller in proportion to its body size. So this tricks the pipit. Also, the egg looks very similar to the pipit's egg. It hatches slightly before the pipit's eggs as well. And then when the young cuckoo's in the nest, this is the young bird actually in a tree pipit nest. They also use tree pipits sometimes. And so it ejects, in this case, the eggs, or in this case, the young tree pipits out of the nest. And then once it's done that, it takes over the nest and gets all the food. Because the parent birds, once the eggs are young, are just outside the nest, they just ignore them. This is the same bird 3 weeks later. And so it's got all the food, it's demanding the pipits to bring in more and more food, and they're hypnotized by this creature, and they can't stop feeding it. It has a bright red gape which hypnotizes them. It comes in feeds on moths and all sorts of things. Keeps the nest clean. Then the day after that, it left the nest. This is another one, the meadow pipit. The pipits will then follow it around for another couple of weeks, feeding it before the cuckoo decides to fly off to Africa, and again it winters down in the Congo jungle down in Africa. In the spring, lots of reptiles out in the moor, lizards, and they like these sort of heathy places. Adders usually come out start about middle of February, and then the males will molt their skin usually early April, and then the females will appear about that time as well. And then you get the mating season of the adders. So this is you get an event called the dance of the adders. I've got a video of that here. So what happens is a male guards a female, and then if another male turns up, there's a fight. And this is a wrestling match, really. It's called the dance of the adders, but it's really a wrestling match between two males and the female. And when they're doing this, they're completely oblivious to people watching them. So these came out right in front of me, and they were fighting for about a quarter of an hour on the path. And the object is to force your opponent's head down on the ground. Also in the same sort of places you get Britain's only silk moth, the emperor moth. Starts off as a tiny little caterpillar, but by the end of the summer it's a huge great thing, very camouflaged on the heather. And overwinters in a very tough silk cocoon. Here's the pupa. I'll just open one up to show the pupa. Then the male moths emerge first. The males are day flying and they emerge usually in early May. They have very feathery antennae and they can detect a pheromone scent produced by the female from well over a mile away, probably further. And so the females emerge usually in late morning. They crawl up onto the heather and then they emit this pheromone and all these males appear from nowhere. The first one to get there mates with her, and then they mate for about 20 minutes, and then the male flies off. And the female will then fly at night and lay her eggs. But both the males and the females only live for about a week, and then they die, leaving the caterpillars to carry on the next generation. This is up in the woods on Dartmoor. This is the bench tour. Beautiful woodlands there, and you've got lots of roe deer in the woods. That's the doe roe deer. This is another one in a summer coat, and she's just given birth to twins. She must have just been newly born, so it's quite unusual to see this in the daytime. That was in Maytime. Also, weird creatures live there, like leopard slug. Slugs are bizarre. Some slugs have weird mating habits, none more so than this one. Slugs are hermaphrodites, so they're male and female at the same time, but they do need to mate. And these ones do it in the most strangest way. They crawl up a branch after dark, and then they entwine their bodies, and then they produce this really thick mucus, and this makes a mucus like bungee jumping rope, and they hang by this and mate in midair. Their sex organs come out the sides of their heads, and they entwine their bodies and the sex organs. They hang from this and mate at night, and then they look quite beautiful actually while they're mating. It's like this glacier blue flower-like structure. And then after mating, they each go their separate ways. And each of those slugs can lay a batch of eggs and start the cycle again. One climbing up and the other one maybe dropped off. So another alien thing is up on Dartmoor in the autumn time. This is a thing called the devil's fingers fungus. It's actually an import from Australia. It was quite large, about the size of my hand. And it comes out of an egg, and it has this brown gunk on it which attracts flies, and the brown gunk contains the spores of the fungus, and it spreads them around the countryside. We do have a native one of these stinky fungi. This is called a stinkworm. This is one emerging from its egg. So this is emerged overnight, and it comes out. It's got a witch's egg. You may, if you haven't seen these, you may well have smelled them. They smell absolutely revolting. And what they have is this brown gunk lever, which contains the spore of the fungus, and this needs to be spread around by the fungus. So it has this horrendous smell, and it uses flies as a carrier system. So this is a bit of video of one actually in action. So it doesn't last long. I found after about an hour or so, there's nothing left of this lever at all, because all these flies appear from nowhere. Suck up, they love this stuff. It absolutely stinks, but they love it. They can't get enough of it. And of course, they again spread these spores all around the countryside, or they die somewhere else, and then the spores will be spread around. So that's how the fungus gets about. I thought it might take a while, but it took less than an hour to actually remove it. At night in the woods at this time of year, there's lots of moths around. It's an unusual time of year for moths, but there are winter moths. You might see them flying around in the headlights this time of year. The females are almost wingless, and the males are the ones you see flying, and they're searching for the females. Just finish off showing you a few birds. There's some bullfinches up in the woods, and this is the sewage works actually in Buckford, which is a good place in the winter for all sorts of birds, because they're attracted to all the little flies that breed in the sewage works. So lots of gold crests, tiny little birds, and these are insect eating, so they've got to survive the winter. But they have a special tactic to cuddle up. So two gold crests will cuddle up with each other at night, and they'll keep warm. And these are them just waking up in the morning. Having a stretch, and then they'll head off for the day. And then I'll just finish off by showing you the long-tailed tits. So the long-tailed tits, there you see them, you may see family parties in your garden and local woods. And at this time of year, they're feeding on tiny little insects which feed on the buds, various things like those aphids on the oaks. They nest very early in the spring, so they'll nest, typically in sort of habitats like this. And then they sort of often in gorse bushes. And then when they build their nest, they fill them with feathers, so they can collect up to 1,000 feathers. They built the nest built out of lichen and moss and spiders' webs, and there's the female inside incubating the eggs. And then both the pair feed the young. But these are uniquely social birds. They're fascinating things, because once the young leave the nest, they're not like other small birds, like robins and sparrows and things, which abandon their young after a few weeks. The long-tailed tits all stay together, so the family groups stay together right through the winter. And they have another special tactic, which is to roost together. So they have certain roosts, which they all know, and they pass the knowledge of them through the generations. So these roosts are used for many, many years. And they roost all in a huddle to keep warm, like this. But the coldest spots are the spots on the outside. Most of them want to get a nice warm spot in the middle. There's a few different roosts here. I found lots of these over the years. It's one of the lovely things to see in the winter. It's all roosting together. And they keep coming back to the same places. So it took a while to find them to start with, but once you know the roost, you can go check them after dark. This is early morning, they wake up and then disperse, but in the evenings they often come back to the same twigs. So this is finish off playing this little video. So this is them forming the roost. So the younger birds in the flock will start the roost, and they all often go onto exactly the same twig. But they're the birds that end up on the outside, because all the more dominant birds barge in. I mean, they look cute, these things, but actually when it comes to getting the warm spot in the roost, they don't mind bustling in there. And all the flocks that you see, so all the flocks you see in your gardens, they always do this at dusk. So about 4 or 5 o'clock at this time of year, they've got their certain places they go, and they'll form a little line like this. And I have seen up to 18 roosting together, but usually it's 5 or 6 or 7 birds. Last one, sort of leader of the pack. Will get its place in amongst the roost, and then they'll settle down for the night. They'll remain in that same spot all over the night, and they'll often come back to that very same self twig the next evening, or they have a sort of variety of different roost sites, so they can go to another one if they need to. Okay, well, thanks very much for listening, and if you have a look at some other information, if you'd like to, on my website, johnwalters.co.uk, and thanks very much. Thank you.
Absolutely fabulous, John. Thank you. So many different videos of things that we would miss, some of us would. And I thought it was wonderful that you needed to go to a bank in Exeter, found it had closed, and Exmouth has still got a bank. And so then you came and in the dark light trying to find some aphids. Which was incredible, because I think most of us would have missed those aphids. So that was incredible. And then something that a few of us, or probably more than a few of us, have never seen is a cuckoo being fed. I mean, that was wonderful video, absolutely superb. And it was great to see your time lapse as well, of you doing your artistry for your cards and everything and illustrations. That was great. And some fabulous photography, and very difficult to achieve because some of what you're photographing is so small that most of us would miss it. And I know, having spent hours up at Alleronde in the summer, which I would recommend for the grasshoppers, it's really, really difficult able to spot all those little creatures, which you have done so well, a real achievement. I think it's absolutely fabulous. It's one of the best sessions we've had, and thank you so much for bringing your backup, which has helped us out tremendously. Sorry, I don't know what's happened to my voice. But anyway, thank you ever so much. Absolutely superb, a real achievement, and I can see why you're doing work for the BBC. Yes, definitely. Thank you.